Gobi Desert grows by about 3,000 kilometers each year. Beijing fighting desertification with...
When word first got out that China was burying straw and planting trees deep in its deserts, most people didn't take it seriously.
I have doubts about the possibility, the viability of this idea.
Environmental groups said it wouldn't work. Scientists called it a waste.
这个沙漠是个持久战，就我的没去过这的娃娃，只有我们有口持久的沙坡上这种活一点。
Critics dismissed it as a hopeless attempt to turn sand into green. How could forests ever grow in a place like that? For years, people pointed at the failed patches and shook their heads at China's bold plan. But quietly, steadily, and without much attention, something surprising was starting to happen. And now, a decade later, even the harshest critics were rethinking their words. The crisis that sparked the mission. Before the world saw trees rising in China's deserts, it was watching something far worse unfold. A growing sea of sand was slowly swallowing parts of the country. Desertification, where good land turns into dry, dead desert, wasn't just an environmental issue in China. By the late 1900s, it had become a serious national threat, putting food supplies and millions of lives at risk. The reasons behind it ran deep. After the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949, the country's fast-growing population and push for industrial progress led to huge stress on the land. Sandstorms came mostly from areas damaged in 4 key ways. Livestock overgrazed the grasslands. Trees were cut down too quickly for timber. Farmland was pushed too hard with poor methods. All of this stripped the land's ability to hold moisture or grow anything. As plants vanished, the wind picked up dry, loose soil and carried it away. Life-giving topsoil was lost. The damage was huge. By the early 2000s, more than 2.6 million square kilometers, over 27% of China's entire land area, was affected by desertification. The hardest-hit regions were in the north and northwest, like Inner Mongolia, Gansu, Ningxia, and Xinjiang. Places that had once been green and full of life were now turning into dry, cracked sand. One of the most frightening examples was the Taklamakan Desert, sometimes called the Sea of Death. It's one of the world's largest sandy deserts, and over the centuries, it had already swallowed ancient towns and trade routes. In more recent times, it kept spreading, moving east, destroying roads and villages, and sending huge sandstorms into cities like Beijing and Tianjin. In 2006 alone, China faced 17 major sandstorms. Some of those dust clouds traveled to South Korea and Japan, and even crossed the ocean to reach parts of the U.S. West Coast. The cost wasn't just environmental, it hit people hard. About 400 million people lived in or near the growing desert zones. Crops didn't grow, water ran out. Families were forced to leave homes that had been theirs for generations. In places like Hai and Inner Mongolia, entire villages had to move, creating one of the world's few cases of government-recognized ecological migrants. People who had to relocate because their land could no longer support life. For China, this was more than an internal disaster. As a country trying to prove its strength to the world through rapid growth and innovation, the spreading desert threatened not only its people, but also its global image. China needed to act, and fast. This wasn't just a quick fix. It was a bold, long-term plan to undo years of damage. Out of this deep crisis came a massive idea: build a green wall strong enough to hold back the desert. A giant man-made forest that could stop the sands in their tracks. And despite the doubts and dust storms, China pushed forward with one of the biggest environmental projects the world had ever seen. China's bold plan revealed. With desertification getting worse each year, China's leaders realized small steps wouldn't cut it anymore. What they needed was something huge, something that had never been done before. And in 1978, they launched it.
This project was launched in 1978. We have started to observe some positive results.
Officially called the 3 North Shelter Forest Program, but more commonly known as the Great Green Wall, this effort became the largest tree planting project in history. The vision was daring. Grow a thick band of forest across the dry, wind-blown lands of northern China. This stretch would cover 3 big regions: Northeast Dongbei, North Hubei, and Northwest Jibei, hence the name 3 Norths. The mission was clear: stop the deserts, especially the fast-moving Gobi and Taklamakan, from pushing into the fertile and heavily populated areas. The project would unfold over 73 years in 8 stages from 1978 to 2050. The target? Restore more than 35 million hectares, about 87 million acres, of land damaged by desertification. The forest strip itself would span over 4,500 kilometers long and 1,500 kilometers wide, stretching like a green arc across China's top half. But this wasn't just about planting trees. It was a full-on national movement. The campaign mixed government planning from the top with active involvement from everyday people. Local governments had set targets for planting and protecting forests. National programs gave rewards and support to those who joined in. In the 1980s, one key move was the Grain for Green program. Farmers who agreed to turn their overused farmland back into grassland or forest were given food and money in return. Everyone had a part to play. Schools, companies, even army units had tree planting goals. In 1981, China made March 12th National Tree Planting Day, a new holiday that encouraged millions to get their hands dirty for a good cause. It wasn't just work, it became a proud act of rebuilding the land. As time went on, the project grew more advanced. The government poured resources into research, tracking tools and satellite systems to check on tree health, survival rates, and the overall effects on the land. The scale of what they were doing was massive. New types of plants had to be chosen, ones that could actually survive the harsh desert conditions. Irrigation systems were tested and tweaked, and creative techniques like straw checkerboards and soil treatments were introduced in later stages. But the Great Green Wall wasn't just about planting forests. The plan also included grassland recovery, growing shrubs, introducing desert-tough crops, and mixing trees with farmland, called agroforestry. Planners knew that relying on just one type of tree wouldn't work. A diverse mix would hold up better in the long run. By the early 2000s, aerial photos started to show patches of green breaking through what used to be empty sand. Some areas still struggled, and failure rates were high, but the effort continued, step by step, with a growing sense of national pride behind it. The world laughed at it. Even as China kept moving forward, many outside the country didn't take it seriously. Experts and news outlets across the world saw the project as unrealistic, idealistic, and bound to collapse. Trying to grow trees in the desert, one of the toughest places on Earth, seemed like a dream, not a real solution. Both foreign and Chinese scientists doubted it would work, and early results didn't help. Satellite images from the late 80s and 90s revealed that many of the new forests had died off. Large patches of land meant for trees had turned into dry, silent groves with nothing left but bare trunks. Reports said that anywhere from 50% to 85% of trees were failing in some regions. For a project this big, those numbers were crushing, and only added fuel to the belief that China was fighting a battle it couldn't win. Environmental experts raised real concerns. A lot of the trees being used, like poplars and certain pines, weren't native to the area. These trees didn't have the natural toughness needed to survive desert conditions. Without enough water, nutrients, or plant variety, these forests were fragile. They got hit hard by disease, pests, and drought. Some scientists said the wrong trees could even make the land worse by pulling too much from the soil and throwing the ecosystem out of balance. Instead of fixing the problem, they warned China might just be creating a new one. Public reaction was rough. International media often painted the project as more show than substance, something that looked good on paper but didn't deliver real results. Headlines in the West questioned the scale, the impact, and whether China was just trying to score points with the public. Some called it a waste of taxpayer money. Foreign aid experts also doubted China's method of top-down orders and mass mobilization. Without deeper changes to how the environment was being handled, they said the plan would never last. And not all the criticism came from outside. Inside China, a few local ecologists spoke out too. They said the campaign was focused too much on quantity, counting how many trees were planted, without keeping track of how many actually lived. Others pointed out that in certain regions, planting trees had started to lower water levels, leaving nearby farms and rivers struggling. The desert wasn't giving up without a fight, and most people still believed no amount of tree planting could stop it. Both literally and figuratively, the world laughed. The phrase, burying money in the sand, became a popular way to mock China's efforts, as if the whole idea was a waste of time and resources. For a while, China was used as an example of environmental efforts gone wrong, a case study in what not to do. But through all the criticism and jokes, China didn't quit. Instead, it dug in deeper, sending teams of scientists and workers straight into the desert to begin what would become one of the most surprising environmental turnarounds in recent memory. The hard work begins. While the rest of the world rolled its eyes at China's dream of desert forests, thousands of people on the ground quietly got to work. These early efforts weren't powered by fancy machines or massive budgets. What they had was grit, creativity, and basic tools that could stand up to some of the toughest conditions on Earth. One of the smartest ideas to come out of this phase was the straw checkerboard method, first developed by Chinese desert researchers in the 1970s. It was simple. Tie straw into small square grids and lay them across the dunes. Each square, about a meter wide, helped break the wind and keep the sand from blowing away. Even better, these straw grids helped trap moisture, collect dust, and gave desert plants a chance to grow. The straw itself came from an unexpected place, China's huge rice industry. Every year, hundreds of millions of tons of leftover rice straw were produced, most of it burned or thrown out. But in the desert, it became a game changer. Trucks carried loads of straw deep into the dunes, where workers spread it out by hand, especially around the edges of the Taklamakan Desert, places where shifting sand often buried roads, villages, and rail lines. At the same time, National Tree Planting Day was turning into a national tradition. It had become a symbol of China's commitment to bringing the land back to life. Between 1982 and 2021, volunteers helped plant over 78 billion trees. Schools, government offices, army units, and community groups all joined in. The event became more than just a tree planting drive. It became a shared act of hope and purpose. But planting trees in the desert wasn't easy. The ground was tough, the sun was brutal. Workers dug holes in dry, lifeless soil, often with barely enough water to keep going. In many places, water had to be brought in by tanker trucks or dug from hand-built trenches. And because the desert soil lacked the richness needed for plants to grow, workers added compost, clay, and other materials to help the ground hold water. These early years were all about setting the stage for something bigger, preparing the land and the people for the long road ahead. Even though a lot of the trees didn't survive, the straw grids were doing their job. In some test areas, they cut down sand movement by more than 99%. That gave the new plants a chance to hang on. It was slow, it was hard, but it was working, one tiny patch at a time. Still, the desert was not backing down. The conditions stayed brutal, and the number of trees that actually survived remained painfully low. The critics kept talking, and for those working out in the sand every day, it was clear the toughest days were still ahead. Struggles, setbacks, and more doubt. Even with the early progress of China's Great Green Wall, the real challenge of stopping the desert turned out to be bigger and tougher than anyone had expected. These deserts weren't just empty stretches of land. They were living, shifting systems shaped by centuries of strong winds, long droughts, and moving sand. Deserts like the Taklamakan and Gobi got as little as 10 millimeters of rain a year. Some spots could go months or even years without a single drop. On top of that, temperatures jumped from blazing 45 degrees Celsius summers to freezing winters that dropped below minus 20 degrees Celsius. In this kind of climate, helping trees survive was a nearly impossible task. In the early planting zones, most young saplings didn't make it past their first year. The soil was dry, sandy, and so poor in nutrients that it couldn't hold water. Even where irrigation was added, the moisture either evaporated fast or drained away before it could do much good. In some of the hardest hit regions, up to 85% of trees died, especially in areas where only one kind of tree like poplar or pine was planted. These monocultures just weren't made for desert life. But it wasn't just the environment causing problems. There were practical and economic hurdles too. Moving water, straw, and seedlings into remote desert locations took a huge workforce and needed heavy government support. Sandstorms could wipe out months of work in hours, covering trenches, snapping saplings, and blowing away straw grids. Forest farms that were supposed to grow and maintain these trees struggled to stay open. And local governments, under pressure to meet planting targets, sometimes focused more on the number of trees than whether they'd actually survive. That led to poor planning and patchy results. As more failures piled up, criticism grew louder. Even within China, some media outlets began to question if the project was worth it. Around the world, publications took fresh aim at the effort, labeling it flawed and unsustainable. Environmental experts warned that planting the same kinds of trees over and over again in dry land wasn't a smart long-term solution and might even do more harm. Some studies pointed out that all the water being used for tree planting could lower the water table, making things worse for local farms and communities. Even a few government-backed scientists started to voice concerns. In research papers and public forums, they began asking if trying to turn deserts into forests was really the right approach. A major 2011 report from the Chinese Academy of Sciences pushed for a rethink. It recommended shifting the focus away from tree planting and toward restoring natural ecosystems. The idea was to work with nature instead of trying to force it into something it couldn't be. And still, despite all of it, China didn't stop. Instead of giving up, the people behind the project started looking at what wasn't working and tried to fix it. They admitted the early mistakes and began putting more energy into research, testing, and finding local solutions that fit each environment better. This marked a turning point for the Great Green Wall. The next phase wasn't about planting more trees, it was about planting smarter. It was about using what they'd learned and applying better science, better planning, and more respect for the land itself. Out of all the failures came something more powerful than just a patch of green. It was the beginning of a new, more balanced approach, one that combined science, engineering, and nature all working together. After years of struggle, dead trees, and constant doubt, it became clear to China that just planting more trees wasn't going to be enough. The desert couldn't be beaten by brute force alone. What was needed were smarter, more flexible strategies, ones that combined ancient ecological wisdom with the latest technology. That realization sparked a major turning point for the Great Green Wall. What had started as a campaign with mixed results was about to become a leading example of environmental problem solving. One of the biggest breakthroughs came with how straw grids were laid. In the beginning, workers had to place each bundle by hand, backbreaking work done under tough desert heat. It worked, but progress was slow. To speed things up, Chinese engineers built machines that could dig trenches and lay the straw grids automatically. These new machines could cover land 4 to 6 times faster than people, allowing the project to scale up in a way that had never been possible before. At the same time, the kinds of plants being used changed. The government stepped away from fragile, fast-growing trees like poplar and eucalyptus that had often failed in the dry climate. Instead, they began using tough native plants that were built to survive. Species like saxaul, tamarisk, goji berries, sea buckthorn, wolfberry, and hardy grasses were added to the mix. These plants didn't just survive, they helped build stronger, healthier ecosystems. China also started working on ways to fix the soil itself. Scientists tested things like biochar, compost, and helpful microbes to help the ground hold onto water and nutrients. In some areas, small drip irrigation systems were set up to make every drop of water count. In others, they added fungi to the soil to help plant roots grow deeper and stronger. The big picture was changing too. Environmental engineering had reached new levels. A good example was the BTU Lanzhou Railway, built right through a desert region. To protect it, they used a mix of straw grids, small forest windbreaks, and gravel strips to stop the sand from burying the tracks. That same method was later used for a high-speed road through the Taklamakan Desert, an area once thought impossible to cross. This wasn't just about growing trees anymore. It was about reshaping the desert so it could support life again. Carefully placed green corridors were planted between sand dunes to trap dust, break the wind, and keep the soil from blowing away. Satellites and drones help track plant health from above, spot trouble areas, and guide changes quickly. What came out of all this was a more thoughtful, well-rounded strategy. It wasn't about planting trees just to say they did. It was about building entire living systems that could last. It was a change built on earlier failures, guided by science, and carried forward with steady determination. And slowly, the results began to speak for themselves. The world that once rolled its eyes was starting to take notice. 10 years later, they regretted it. A decade after people had mocked China for burying straw in the sand, something remarkable was happening. The same deserts that once seemed lost were now showing signs of health, growth, and even new hope. The land that had been written off was starting to come back. The dream once seen as impossible had become a proven success story. And those who had doubted it most were suddenly quiet, watching as China's vision became real. In 2024, China reached a major milestone, the completion of a 3,000-kilometer greenbelt around the Taklamakan Desert, one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. That single achievement quieted many of the remaining skeptics. Where giant sand dunes once threatened to bury towns, roads, and train lines, there was now stable ground, held in place by straw grids, native plants, and growing ecosystems that could survive on their own. From just 2016 to 2020, China had already turned over 21.7 million acres of desert into green space. By 2024, the total area reforested since the project began had passed 30 million hectares. Forest coverage across the country had jumped from just 10% in 1949 to more than 25%. Entire regions that once suffered from constant dust storms, like Inner Mongolia, Ningxia, and parts of Xinjiang, saw huge improvements. Sandstorms came less often and with less force. Cities that used to be covered in yellow clouds during spring were now seeing blue skies and breathing cleaner air. But the most stunning proof came from above. Satellite photos began showing wide bands of green cutting through northern deserts, forming protective layers around farms, roads, and towns. Where images had once shown dying trees and endless gray sand, they now revealed neat patterns of straw grids and healthy vegetation stretching for hundreds of kilometers. The BTU Lanzhou Railway, once thought doomed to vanish under drifting dunes, was still running smoothly, protected by the very methods that used to be mocked. The high-speed highway across the Taklamakan, still standing. Guarded by gravel strips and green plant belts, it had become a symbol of what was possible. What experts had once called a fantasy had turned into a clear success, built with careful design, patience, and determination. But this wasn't just an environmental win, it brought real economic change too. Places that were once empty and forgotten started welcoming tourists eager to walk through the desert's forest corridors. Some local families began growing goji berries, grapes, and herbs suited to the dry climate, turning dry, abandoned land into useful farmland. Government support for eco-friendly farming helped create jobs, cut down poverty, and gave struggling communities new hope. And outside China, the world began paying attention. International environmental groups and other desert-affected countries started studying the project closely. China was no longer the target of jokes. It had become a model, a real-world example of how smart ideas, when backed by long-term planning and national effort, could reshape even the toughest land. A global model of transformation. What started out as a daring project inside China had grown into something the whole world could learn from. The country's long fight against desertification didn't just bring life back to dead land. It helped change how people everywhere think about reforestation, resilience, and what's possible when a nation sticks with a goal. From 2000 to 2017, satellite data from NASA showed something unexpected. Even though many places were losing forests, the world's green cover was actually going up, and over 25% of that increase came from China alone. The Great Green Wall was a major part of that, along with other efforts in sustainable land use and tree planting across the country. Together, these programs flipped the story, from land in decline to land reborn. And the benefits were measurable. As the greenery spread, it helped pull more carbon out of the air, supporting China's work to cut emissions and play a bigger role in fighting climate change. Dust storms faded, soil stopped blowing away, farms started producing more, and for people living nearby, breathing got easier. Fewer storms meant better health and better harvests. As the reforested zones grew, they started to support pockets of life. Birds returned, insects buzzed through the new trees. Small animals found shelter. These were early signs of real ecosystems beginning to take shape. Simple, smart ideas, like using leftover rice straw, involving local communities through tree planting days, and using machines to speed up forest work, could be copied in all kinds of places. The model worked. Chinese experts were even invited to help with Africa's Great Green Wall Initiative, a project that aims to grow a strip of green from Senegal all the way to Djibouti. Back home, the sense of pride was growing fast. News reports showed side-by-side photos of lifeless dunes turned into thriving green land. Comment sections filled with people amazed at the changes. One post went viral. They said it couldn't be done. But look at this. Only in China can you witness a desert bloom like this. It wasn't just a line, it became a message of what's possible when a nation sets its mind to something. What China had done, blending old traditions with new tech, local effort with national vision, science with sheer scale, was something other nations now wanted to learn from. It showed that when you keep going, keep learning, and keep adjusting, even a land once written off as hopeless can be brought back to life. The world once laughed when China started burying plants in the desert. But 10 years later, those voices went quiet. The sand gave way to trees. The doubt turned into awe. And a project once mocked became a source of global inspiration. What do you think about China's Great Green Wall? If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video. Let's spread the message, because when we work with nature, even the impossible can grow into something beautiful.